Walking along the Thames River in London, Ontario, it can be hard to imagine that there was once a time when steamboats ferried passengers up and down this waterway. Not only did these ships once navigate the river, but they were also involved in one of Canada's worst maritime disasters.
Well, at least up to that point in time.
Yeah, which is what we'll be talking about in this episode. On May 24th, 1881, the SS Victoria capsized, and upwards of 200 passengers and rescuers lost their lives. We're going to start by discussing how this area and the Thames looked in the late 1800s. Then we'll follow the path the Victoria sailed and discuss the circumstances which led to this tragedy.
Our story takes place near the end of the 1800s, and we want to start by setting the stage a bit on how this area looked back then, because if you've been to London, Ontario in the modern era, you might be wondering how a steamboat could have gotten down this river. Well, back then, London was a growing city. At the time of our story, the population was about 26,000. Only a decade earlier, it was 18,000. And it was around that time the city's council and medical association realized that London needed a proper and constant water supply to be able to grow, keep the inhabitants healthy, and keep the buildings and businesses safe from fire.
So how'd they do that?
Well, there were freshwater springs found along the Thames River that could be used as the water source. They built a dam here that was used to power the Pumphouse, which moved the water from the springs to holding ponds. And then from there, the water was pumped to a reservoir at the top of this hill,
known then as Hungerford Hill and now as Reservoir Park.
From up here, there was enough elevation to get the water to where it needed to go throughout the city. Getting it built wasn't so easy, as there was a lot of opposition, seemingly mostly to do with the cost and taxes associated with the project. So it took a few years and a few referendums, but finally the project was approved, and by 1879, the Waterworks was working. Because of the dam that was put in, the river upstream rose, and this didn't really make the Thames in this section deep per se, but it gave it enough depth that these steamboats,
which only need about 6 or 7 inches of depth,
were able to navigate the river without too much trouble. There were still sandbars, rocks, and old dams that needed to be avoided, especially depending on the time of year.
A recreation industry grew around the new waterworks. What we know as Springbank Park at the time was called Waterworks Park. A couple of hotels popped up that were just a stone's throw from the Pumphouse. It can be seen here in these pictures. It's unclear if the building was actually a hotel or if it was just in the name. From what we're able to find out, it was more of a dance hall. Just across the river and maybe about 200 meters upstream was the Ward Hotel. It seemed like quite the happening place, and apparently even had a cockfighting ring.
Definitely not safe by 21st century standards.
Yeah. Both these places had wharfs where water sports were observed. So the area had a hotel, a dance hall, there were sports, picnic areas, and also a lookout from the top of the hill where the reservoir was. Streetcars hadn't yet come into the picture, and the crowds were too great for horse and buggy. So to get all these people to and from the Waterworks region, there were steamboats. 3 steamboats ran this stretch of the river: the Princess Louise, the Forest City, and the Victoria. For just 15 cents, people could be taken from a wharf at the fork of the Thames down to Waterworks Park.
So that brings us to May 24th, 1881, Victoria Day. The holiday was always a busy one for the steamboats, and thousands of people had been ferried up and down the Thames throughout the day. The Victoria was at Springbank/Waterworks Wharf, loading up passengers for what was supposed to be the ship's last voyage of the day, but would end up being its last ever. As we travel along the route it took that day, we'll add up the facts and events which both indirectly and directly led to the tragedy. Firstly, the Victoria was not this boat's original name. It started its life as the Enterprise, and a couple of years prior to these events, it had caught fire and sank, having only run one season on the Thames. What remained of its hull was raised, and $5,000
in 1880 dollars
was spent to expand that hull and basically rebuild and revamp the vessel. Just a year later, the boiler was moved 5 feet forward to increase the ship's speed. When that first rebuild was complete, the boat was renamed the SS Victoria. We've talked in past episodes about renaming boats being bad luck if not done properly. So the first points are a boat made from the remains of a sunken steamer, then it being modified, and if you believe in superstitions, a renamed boat.
Earlier, we mentioned how these steamships only need about half a foot of water to operate, and that even with the dam, there were many spots the ships could get caught up on. Well, the Victoria was on its way back to Springbank for its last scheduled trip of that day. It came across the Forest City,
which was one of the other steamships,
which had hit a sandbar and was currently stuck. The Princess Louise, the third ship, was assisting the Forest City trying to pull it free. This meant that when the SS Victoria arrived at the wharf at Springbank Park/Waterworks, a crowd that was expecting 3 ships found only 1 ship for the last trip of the day.
Now, although the captain told the passengers there'd be 2 more boats coming eventually, they crowded onto the boat, which had already been carrying a number of customers from previous stops. It wasn't long before the Victoria, which had been built to carry 400, was loaded with over 600 people. The overburdened steamship began its voyage up the river towards the Forks. Captain Rankin refused any new passengers at his stops along the way, which, from what we could find, would have been at least the wharf across the Thames at the Ward Hotel and also the wharf at the Woodland Cemetery. A reporter for the Advertiser named James Drennan was on the SS Victoria that day, and he later wrote about the experience. He noted that as they sailed by Griffith's Dam, which was just a bit before the Woodland Wharf, there was water on the first deck, about ankle deep, and that the crowd on the boat kept moving from one side to the other.
I guess to view things on the shore and the river.
And this movement was causing the boat to rock quite a bit.
So the passengers were reacting to these events pretty differently. On one hand, some noticed the rocking of the ship and the water on the deck, and they jumped overboard, swimming to shore. Others, possibly oblivious to the water on the Victoria, disobeyed the warnings of the captain and crew. They continued dashing from side to side. By this point, Captain Rankin knew that the ship wouldn't make it to its destination and began to steer the Victoria towards a sandbar in hopes of beaching the ship before things got worse. But things were about to get much worse.
Here, in the Thames River, around the present-day Greenway Dog Park, 2 young men, Harry Nichols and Michael Reedy of the London Rowing Club, seeing the steamboat, decided to race it. The crowd aboard the Victoria rushed towards the right side.
Starboard, we are talking boats.
Correction, the starboard side of the boat. So the crowd rushed to the starboard railing of the ship to witness this race, and immediately the boat swayed heavily to that side. Quickly, the people on board realized their mistake and tried to correct it, scrambling to the port side of the ship. The Victoria began to capsize, and the stress was too great for supports holding up the boiler. It broke loose, releasing scalding hot water on the passengers and taking out the support beams for the upper deck. That upper deck and its commuters came crashing down on the people below, killing some instantly and trapping the others beneath the water. This all happened in a matter of moments, and those that weren't trapped were flung from the lurching ship. With these new structural changes and the difference in volume of passengers, the Victoria didn't fully capsize. It actually kind of righted itself and then began to sink. It may be quite shallow here now, but we read that at the time, it may have been as deep as 17 feet in this area. Those who managed to escape the ship weren't necessarily safe either. They were in a panic, crawling over each other, some were injured, and the women wore the large, heavy, and cumbersome dresses of the time.
Right away, passerbys began to help, jumping in the water from the shore to help drag people to safety, and others pulling victims into the boats.
This included the men who had been racing the Victoria and would have witnessed the whole event.
It wasn't long before the Princess Louise had arrived at the scene of the accident to help with the rescue, and soon the recovery of bodies. As they were pulled from the wreck in the water, the bodies were placed on the upper deck of the Princess Louise. There were so many that they needed to be stacked one on top of each other. By 10 o'clock that evening, the Princess Louise had returned to the wharf at the Forks with over 150 bodies. It also wasn't only passengers who died in the event. Among those who died were 2 skinny dippers who were swimming in the river at the time and swam over to help. They apparently became exhausted while helping and drowned. Another man died from pneumonia after helping retrieve bodies from the cold water. As the recovery continued over the next few weeks, the total number of lost would reach somewhere between 180 and 200. Although the exact number doesn't seem to be known, there were at least 181 confirmed. With no passenger logs on the ship, it was just believed that not all the bodies were found. This made it one of Canada's worst ever maritime disasters at that time.
In the immediate aftermath, there were a number of interesting and awful reports. Firstly, with so many dead all at once, the city quickly ran out of coffins. Suppliers in Toronto, Hamilton, and other cities were contacted to send more. And unfortunately for the grieving families, there were some eager to benefit off of them. It was reported in the London Free Press that various services such as liverymen, dragmen, and draymen all doubled their rates to take advantage of the demand.
The city was in mourning, but they were also mad, and the people wanted answers and justice. An inquiry was held in June to determine the cause and who to blame. There were a few additional factors that the jury believed contributed to the disaster. It was thought that there was probably a small hole somewhere in the hull that had been letting in water. This would have meant that the wood in the bottom of the ship was already waterlogged. They also believed that the boiler was not properly secured and that the upper deck wasn't sufficiently supported. Of course, these details couldn't really be proven since the boat had been completely broken apart. But they were, of course, convinced. If you remember, we did mention how the boat was rebuilt, restored, and the boiler moved. So it's definitely possible that the company cheaped out on that work. Captain Donald Rankin and the engineer George Parrish were both arrested for manslaughter. The captain, because he had failed to inspect the Victoria before that day and when the voyage began, and the engineer because he had failed to inform the captain of the boat's condition. Both of their charges were eventually dropped by the Middlesex grand jury, so no one actually ever went to prison for this disaster.
The disaster did, however, put a damper on the Thames River steamboat business.
I bet.
We read that the Forest City and the Princess Louise, the other 2 boats, were quickly docked for the season. But we know at least the Princess Louise went back into service because, during a great flood in 1883, it went over the Waterworks dam, killing 7 people on board. It wasn't long before a streetcar line was built and extended out to the Waterworks/Springbank Park, which I imagine was a lot more convenient. Although the steamboat's popularity waned, riverboats made a bit of a comeback in the 1960s, and you could take a ride on paddle wheelers from Springbank Park. This went on up until the 2000s, when Springbank Dam was damaged and the water level became too low to operate the boats.
That brings us to now. Springbank Dam is in the process of being decommissioned, and the old Waterworks Dam has long since been destroyed. I doubt we'll be seeing any large passenger ships traveling down the Thames anytime soon, but never say never. What does remain from this sad bit of history are the monuments to those who died that day. Not far from the site where the Victoria sank is a plaque along with the Victoria's salvaged anchor. Just south and north of the disaster site are the Woodland Cemetery and the Mount Pleasant Cemetery, where you'll find grave markers of many of the victims of that day.